Man, I'm blessed. It's been one heck of a year. 6 surgeries on my hip, the fire, but I took them all in stride. You know, good things and bad things are going to happen to you. You just got to turn them into good things, and a lot of really good has come about this. My family's alive, and I'm blessed.
Mark Coleman, a true pioneer of MMA and one of the most feared fighters in the early UFC, is now facing the tragic consequences of a career built on physical dominance and sheer will. Known for his brutal ground-and-pound style and iconic victories, Coleman was one of the first UFC heavyweight champions and a major influence in the sport's development. But today, at 58 years old, the man who once ruled the octagon now battles the lasting effects of a violent career, including severe health problems, financial struggles, and personal isolation. The harsh realities of aging, combined with the aftermath of years of physical punishment, have left Coleman in a difficult position. Once a larger-than-life figure in MMA, he now confronts a future marked by physical pain, regret, and the lingering effects of his violent past. This is the tragic story of Mark Coleman's life at 58. Once a legend in the cage, now a man struggling to navigate the consequences of his career. Mark Coleman's journey into MMA began with an extensive background in wrestling, which would lay the foundation for his future success. Born on December 20, 1964, in Fremont, Ohio, Coleman was a natural athlete. He became a standout in amateur wrestling, winning an NCAA Division I championship in 1988 while competing at Ohio State University. His wrestling achievements were impressive, but it was his transition into mixed martial arts that would cement his legacy in combat sports history. In the early days of the UFC, when the sport was still in its infancy, Mark Coleman emerged as a dominant force. Unlike the flashy kickboxers and submission specialists who dominated the early UFC, Coleman relied on his wrestling background, using his takedowns and ground control to overwhelm opponents. His no-nonsense, aggressive style was perfectly suited for the brutal, unregulated environment of early UFC events, where technique and strategy were often secondary to raw strength and the ability to take punishment. Coleman's first major breakthrough came in 1997, when he won the UFC 12 heavyweight tournament. It was his ability to dictate the pace of the fight with his wrestling skills that allowed him to dominate the competition. This victory solidified his place in UFC history, and Coleman quickly became one of the most feared fighters in the promotion. His ground-and-pound technique, where he would take opponents to the ground and land heavy, unrelenting strikes, became a hallmark of his fighting style. His rise to the top was rapid, as Coleman would go on to become the first UFC heavyweight champion, dominating the competition with his raw power and relentless approach. In the early UFC, where many fights were determined by who could endure the most punishment, Coleman's relentless aggression and physical dominance made him an unstoppable force. He helped pave the way for future champions, and is often credited as one of the fighters who made the sport of MMA what it is today. Mark Coleman's reign in the UFC was defined by his unrelenting power, wrestling dominance, and raw aggression. After winning the UFC 12 heavyweight tournament in 1997, Coleman immediately established himself as one of the most feared men in the UFC. His victory over Gary Goodridge in the tournament finals showcased his wrestling skills and ground-and-pound technique. This was just the beginning of a career that would solidify his place as a pioneer in the sport. At UFC 12, Coleman's victory marked the beginning of a new era in MMA. He became the first UFC heavyweight champion, a title he defended with authority in subsequent matches. Coleman's fighting style was brutal and straightforward. He dominated his opponents with aggressive takedowns, controlling them on the ground with his superior wrestling and landing devastating strikes. It was this ability to out-muscle opponents, combined with his incredible stamina and strength, that made him a dominant force in the UFC. During his reign as champion, Coleman's matches were often short, explosive, and intense. His fights against opponents like Dan Severn, who was another wrestling-based fighter, solidified Coleman's position as one of the sport's first true stars. His ability to overpower opponents with his physicality and control the pace of the fight made him a standout competitor in the UFC's early days. However, it was his legendary UFC 10 tournament performance that truly cemented his status as a champion. Coleman defeated a range of top fighters in a brutal, no-holds-barred battle, showcasing not only his wrestling skills, but his ability to adapt to the evolving nature of mixed martial arts. In the years that followed, Coleman continued to compete at the highest level. His UFC 17 victory over Dan Severn, in which he secured a unanimous decision, was another key moment in his career. Coleman's sheer tenacity, wrestling pedigree, and aggressive approach made him one of the most respected fighters in the sport. His UFC career was a testament to his fighting spirit and relentless pursuit of victory, laying the groundwork for future generations of MMA stars. However, Coleman's success in the UFC was not without its costs. The intensity of his fighting style and his reliance on brute strength came with a price, one that would haunt him later in life. Despite his dominance in the octagon, the injuries and physical toll from his years of fighting would eventually catch up to him, leading to the struggles he now faces in his later years. As Mark Coleman's career progressed, the very style that made him a legend in the UFC began to take its toll on his body. His aggressive brawler mentality was his trademark, but it also meant that Coleman took more damage than most fighters. His career was built on overwhelming his opponents with sheer power and strength, using his wrestling to control the fight. However, over time, this strategy led to a series of physical setbacks that would plague him in his later years. By the early 2000s, Coleman began to experience significant injuries. His reliance on power and strength in the cage led to joint problems, back pain, and issues with his knees. These physical ailments started to hinder his ability to perform at the level he once had. While he was still able to compete, the once dominant fighter found it more difficult to maintain the same pace and aggression that had defined his career. Coleman continued to fight in the UFC and other promotions, but the toll of years of brawling and taking punishment in the cage began to show. The most debilitating injuries were to his knees and back. Coleman, who had once been known for his explosive takedowns and relentless ground control, found himself unable to move with the same fluidity and speed as before. His joints, worn down from years of intense competition, became a constant source of pain, limiting his range of motion and affecting his overall mobility. These injuries led to a series of setbacks in his career, and his performances began to suffer as a result. At the same time, Coleman's mental state started to decline. The physical toll of his career, combined with the realization that his body was no longer capable of performing at the elite level, led to bouts of depression and frustration. For someone who had built his identity on being a dominant force in MMA, the loss of his fighting abilities was a devastating blow. Coleman found himself facing the inevitable: the end of his fighting career and the painful transition to a life outside the octagon. The final years of Coleman's fighting career were marked by injuries, losses, and the grim reality that age had caught up to him. The fierce, unrelenting competitor that had once taken the UFC by storm was now dealing with the aftermath of a brutal career, struggling to maintain the strength and physicality that had once made him a legend. Despite Mark Coleman's legendary status as one of MMA's early pioneers, his financial situation has not reflected the magnitude of his contributions to the sport. Like many early UFC fighters, Coleman's paydays were not nearly as lucrative as those of today's top stars. The UFC in the 90s and early 2000s was a different world, with fewer financial opportunities outside of actual fights. Fighters didn't benefit from big sponsorships, media deals, or the high-paying pay-per-view revenue that modern fighters enjoy. In his prime, Coleman made enough money to live comfortably, but he didn't have the foresight to secure his financial future. His lack of financial planning during the height of his career left him unprepared for life after MMA. While UFC fighters today are often able to leverage their fame into lucrative contracts, business ventures, and endorsement deals, Coleman did not take advantage of these opportunities. He relied heavily on his fight purses without investing wisely for the long term. This financial oversight became more apparent as Coleman moved into retirement. His career in the cage ended, but the bills didn't stop coming. Without the continuous influx of fight income, Coleman found it difficult to maintain the lifestyle to which he had become accustomed. His attempts at post-fight ventures, including coaching and some media work, didn't generate the steady income necessary to sustain him financially. These financial struggles have only worsened over time, as Coleman's ability to generate significant income from fighting is now non-existent. Coleman has been open about his financial woes in interviews, admitting that he didn't plan for retirement and, as a result, is now struggling to make ends meet. The once legendary fighter is now forced to face the reality of not having the resources to support himself as he enters his later years. This struggle highlights a common issue faced by many fighters who are unable to translate their fighting success into financial stability after their careers end. While Mark Coleman's fighting career brought him fame and recognition, his personal life has been far more complicated. As a man who defined himself by his aggression and physical prowess, Coleman's identity was deeply intertwined with his role as a fighter. This single-minded focus on MMA, however, took a toll on his relationships and left him emotionally disconnected from those closest to him. In his prime, Coleman's career consumed him. The constant training, fighting, and traveling left little room for the personal connections that are necessary to maintain a healthy, balanced life. This obsession with his career, coupled with the emotional intensity required to compete at such a high level, led to fractured relationships with family members, friends, and romantic partners. Coleman has admitted that the demands of his fighting career made it difficult for him to maintain a stable personal life. He has been married and divorced multiple times, and his relationships with his children have been strained at times. As he retired from fighting and the UFC's spotlight faded, Coleman found himself alone. The mental and physical toll of his career led to bouts of depression and emotional isolation, leaving him with fewer people to lean on. Many of his former UFC peers found success as coaches, analysts, or in other ventures, but Coleman struggled to find his place in a world that had moved on from his era of dominance. His health issues, which left him physically incapable of doing the things he once loved, further isolated him, leaving him to cope with both the external changes in his life and the internal battles with his own emotions. At 58 years old, Coleman is more isolated than ever. The fighter who once dominated the octagon with his strength and toughness now finds himself alone, facing a reality far removed from the glory days of his prime. His inability to connect emotionally with others, combined with the struggles of aging and physical decline, has led to a deep sense of loneliness. While his fame as an MMA icon remains intact, it is a solitary fame, with fewer people around him to share in his accomplishments or provide the support he needs. Mark Coleman's fighting style, built on his incredible strength and wrestling background, was known for its dominance and intensity. But the same attributes that made him a fearsome competitor inside the octagon also caused long-term damage to his body. The heavy toll his brutal fighting style took on his joints, muscles, and brain is now apparent as he grapples with significant health issues in his 50s. Fry's physical problems began during his career, but have worsened with age. The repeated blows to his body, especially his back, knees, and neck, have left him struggling with chronic pain. The damage to his knees, in particular, has become a major issue as the years have passed. Coleman has undergone multiple surgeries over the years to alleviate the pain in his knees and other areas of his body, but these surgeries have only provided temporary relief. His joints and ligaments have been worn down from years of intense training, fighting, and the physical wear and tear of the MMA cage. Perhaps the most troubling health issue that Coleman faces is the effect of repeated head trauma. As one of the early stars in MMA, Coleman fought in a time when concussion management was not as advanced as it is today. The frequent blows to the head and brutal knockout losses have left Coleman with symptoms consistent with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, a neurodegenerative condition linked to repeated brain injuries. Coleman has admitted to experiencing memory loss, confusion, and other cognitive issues that are common among fighters who have sustained multiple concussions over the course of their careers. These health problems have greatly impacted Coleman's quality of life. The once physically dominant fighter who was known for his unrelenting style of ground and pound now finds himself struggling with the most basic physical tasks. Even something as simple as walking can be a challenge due to the wear and tear on his body. The debilitating pain and cognitive decline have left Coleman with a sense of hopelessness at times, and the man who once ruled the octagon now finds himself in constant battle with his own body. The tragic reality of aging as an MMA legend has hit Coleman harder than he could have ever imagined when he first stepped into the cage. As Mark Coleman enters his later years, the harsh reality of fading into obscurity after his iconic UFC career has set in. Once a cornerstone of MMA's early success, Coleman now finds himself struggling to stay relevant in a sport that has evolved beyond recognition. While he was one of the early UFC stars and a defining figure in the development of mixed martial arts, the world of MMA has changed dramatically since his time at the top. The athletes today are faster, more technical, and more versatile than ever. And the aggressive, ground-and-pound style that Coleman was known for has become increasingly obsolete in the modern MMA landscape. Coleman's name still carries weight among longtime MMA fans, but for many of today's younger fans, his legacy is not as fresh or revered. His attempts to remain a visible figure in the sport through coaching, occasional media appearances, and public speaking engagements have been less successful than he likely hoped. The UFC has moved on from the era that made Coleman a star, and while fighters like Conor McGregor, Khabib Nurmagomedov, and John Jones have dominated headlines, Coleman's role in the sport feels like a distant memory. His inability to adapt to the changing world of MMA has left him feeling irrelevant. Coleman's attempts to engage with the sport in a post-retirement career have been overshadowed by younger, more marketable fighters who have capitalized on their own fame and success. The UFC's spotlight has shifted to newer generations of fighters, and Coleman's once prominent place in the sport has faded. This transition from a revered champion to a forgotten figure has been a difficult pill to swallow. The man who once dominated the UFC now finds himself grappling with not only physical decline, but also a sense of lost relevance in a world that has moved on without him. Mark Coleman's financial situation, once fueled by his dominance in the UFC, has worsened over the years, and the man who earned significant paydays in his prime now faces the harsh reality of financial instability. The UFC in the 90s and early 2000s was a much different organization, and while fighters like Coleman earned a decent living, they did not have the lucrative contracts, sponsorships, or endorsement deals that today's top fighters enjoy. His career, though successful, did not provide him with the financial safety net needed for a comfortable post-fighting life. While Coleman made good money during his career, he lacked financial foresight. Like many early UFC stars, Coleman didn't benefit from the massive pay-per-view revenue that modern-day UFC champions experience. Additionally, fighters from his era didn't have the same opportunity to build wealth outside the ring through business ventures, promotions, or partnerships. Coleman was a fighter, and that's where his focus remained. When his fighting career ended, he found himself without the steady stream of income that comes with an active professional career. Coleman has admitted that he didn't plan for life after fighting. His money was spent on maintaining a lifestyle that, while manageable during his prime, became unsustainable after retirement. In his later years, he found it difficult to maintain the same financial comfort that he once enjoyed. Attempts at business ventures and promotional work have not been enough to secure the financial stability that Coleman needs as he ages. His failure to build a foundation for life after fighting has left him struggling to make ends meet. While some former UFC fighters have transitioned to coaching or media roles, Coleman's post-retirement career has not been as lucrative, and this financial instability has only added to the stress of aging and dealing with health issues. As Mark Coleman approaches his later years, his reflections on his career are marked by a deep sense of regret. While he was one of the first UFC heavyweight champions and an MMA pioneer, the legacy he helped build is now overshadowed by the struggles he faces in his post-fighting life. The man who once dominated the octagon with his wrestling and raw power now looks back at his career and wonders if things could have been different. With a body that is broken, finances that are strained, and relationships that have suffered, Coleman has come to realize the true cost of his career. One of the greatest regrets that Coleman often speaks about is the toll his fighting style took on his body. His no-holds-barred approach to fighting, which once made him a fan favorite and a dominant force in the cage, has left him with lifelong injuries and chronic pain. The knees, back, and shoulders that once enabled him to power through opponents now hinder his daily life. The joint pain, compounded by his inability to take proper care of his body after years of grueling fights, has become a permanent part of his existence. His failure to take a more measured approach to training and fighting is something Coleman has expressed regret over in interviews. In addition to the physical damage, Coleman reflects on how his career affected his personal life. The long hours spent training and fighting left little time for family or personal relationships. And Coleman has openly admitted that his marriages and family life suffered as a result. The intensity of his fighting career left him emotionally unavailable, and as a result, he has faced the consequences of fractured relationships with loved ones. Coleman's legacy in MMA is secure, but the tragedy of his story is that his success in the sport came at a high personal cost. Now, in his 50s, he faces the painful realization that the glory of his prime years is followed by a life filled with regret, isolation, and physical suffering. The man who helped shape MMA into what it is today now finds himself in a battle for his health, his finances, and his place in a world that has long since moved on from the early days of the sport. His story is one of triumph, yes, but it is also a tragic reminder of the toll that a career in MMA can take on a fighter, both physically and emotionally.